Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II Podcast, Episode 302, interview with Lesley Blume about her book, Fallout, the Hiroshima Cover Up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Lesley MM Blume is an award-winning journalist, historian, and New York Times best-selling author. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, The New York Times, National Geographic, The Wall Street Journal, and the Paris Review Daily, among other publications. Some of her books include Everybody Behaves Badly, It Happened Here, and Let's Bring Back. Today, we will cover the Truman administration's attempt to cover up the true extent and nature of the two atomic bombs. And Lesley, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on and for picking Fallout as a subject.
Absolutely. Now, before we get into your book, I just have to say this, and we kind of covered this a little bit in the emails back and forth a couple of weeks ago, but I bought your audiobook. I appreciate the publisher sending me a copy, but I love audiobooks. I was listening to the audiobook on my front porch, and it's a very pleasant view. It's a beautiful night, and I'm listening to the introduction. And after that introduction ended, I literally hit pause, and I had to stop listening to the book for the next 2 days. There was so much information in that introduction, and to be honest with you, the way you presented it made my blood freeze about any future war that we might have. And so I think it's important to point out this story is a clear demonstration that all governments, even our own government in Washington, has to be watched closely. They have to be held accountable because it's in their very nature to look out for themselves, to hold on to power more than they have to try to serve the American people. So if you could give us an idea, how did this incredible, very detailed, but emotionally powerful introduction of your book come about? And I just have to ask, what did you feel as you were putting those words together?
Well, first of all, I'm both glad and sorry that it affected you that way, because it sounds like it was fairly traumatic. The introduction, I always had a really complicated relationship with introductions for my nonfiction books, and I'll start with one because I'll start my entire manuscript writing an introduction because it helps me really clarify what the entire trajectory of the book is going to look like, and it's always a very careful dance, to figure out how much do you put in, how much do you reveal in the introduction, and how much do you tease out in it. And also another, really big question for me and for my editor, who is my extremely close editorial confidant, is how much contemporary information, contextualizing contemporary information do you put into it? Because, while that it definitely makes historical material relatable to readers when the book comes out, the idea also is that the book has a long shelf life and remains relevant for a long time, as Hersey's Hiroshima itself has. And so, my book is about, how the U.S. government tried to tell the story of the atomic bombs in 1945, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, how they covered up the true radioactive aftermath and its effect on humans, and how one reporter got in on the ground almost a year later and was able to reveal the truth about nuclear weapons to a worldwide readership. And, it was incredibly important to me that I bring his work back to a modern readership, but also that people would read my own book about him and spread, his story 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. And so, for instance, while I was incredibly tempted to put in a lot of stuff about our current president, Donald Trump, and his totally cavalier approach to nuclear matters, threatening to, eviscerate Afghanistan, threatening to eviscerate North Korea, threatening to toss a nuclear weapon into a hurricane to try to dissipate it. I mean, it's like the lack of comprehension is so total. Right. And I think, including information like that would have been really driven home the point of the perilousness of our landscape right now. But again, it was a really excruciating writing and rewriting process as we tried to get to the right balance of timely and timeless. And ultimately, this John Hersey's work, which I document in my book, and Fallout, my book, are a warning to the world, and it's a warning that we have forgotten somewhat unfathomably. I mean, I can't believe that this is it's
right.
the most perilous threat, but it has been largely forgotten. Right now, it's not even part of the debate for tomorrow night. It's not even a debate topic. And it's the most hair trigger and irreversible existential global threat. And the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists has deemed this the most perilous nuclear landscape ever.
Right.
More than at any point during the depths of the Cold War. And so it felt important to me to drive home to modern readers where we are right now and why this matters. And the fact is that if we had a World War III today and it was a nuclear World War III, as Albert Einstein said, I don't know exactly how World War III will be fought, but I can tell you if nuclear weapons are involved, World War IV will be fought with rocks.
Wow. Yes, that was the moment. I just had to stop for a second. And he's absolutely right, because we now, I think you obviously say this in your book, we now have the ability to destroy our entire planet. I mean, it's just, we can do it now if we're not careful. If I could just...
many times over.
Yes,
many
absolutely.
times over. I mean, our arsenal isn't even peak right now. I mean, we have global arsenal is about 13,500 warheads. I mean, it was 3 times that at the height of the Cold War, but that's still enough to eviscerate life on Earth many times over.
Right. If I could just for a second before we go on to the next question, because you bring up obviously the core of your book, and it kind of goes, or I guess a good example of it goes like this. If you grab the average American now who did not ever read a history book that they weren't forced to, they never took a history course that they weren't required to graduate high school, whatever. But if you were asked them about nuclear or atomic bombs, they could tell you this one fact. They could go, oh, it's not just a bomb. It's really nasty. And there's some stuff afterwards, radiation, whatever they call it, and it's still around and it's dangerous. To us, that's common sense, but it didn't have to be common sense, like you were saying earlier, because of what the government was trying to cover up after using these 2 bombs. It's John Hersey, his book, and people like that made that fact the common sense that it is today.
Well, yeah, I mean, largely we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of nuclear attack because John Hersey showed us. Mm-hmm. And, in this extremely... in this document that was, told from the point of view of 6 blast survivors who experienced and witnessed nuclear attack. And I mean, it's an excruciating, awful detail. Right. One of the things about his work is that it's so visceral, but people also really place themselves in the shoes of these Hiroshima blast survivors. And, even though they're experiencing it through residents of Hiroshima, they're imagining could be New York or this could be Detroit, because that's accurate. It could be any place. There's no place on the globe that's safe from this threat, and that was true within a year of 1945. I mean, you could load nukes onto missiles by very quickly after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And look, because of the occupation of Japan, the Japanese weren't able to tell the world in their own words what it had been like to be on the receiving end of nuclear warfare. It was John Hersey who got in, and told the world in 1946 and painted this very vivid picture of, what was at stake in terms of holding our leadership to account and really making the global audience fully aware of the implications of having moved into the atomic age and how completely dangerous, global warfare would be in the future now that nuclear weapons were a fact.
Okay, so we're going to get into that in a second, but I do have to ask one other question, because this is one of my favorite questions, because you always wonder how these things come about. But how did this story come to you, or you come to it, and then how did the book come about itself?
Well, I mean, the story found me as much as I found it, and I knew that, which is amazing how that works. I mean, and now that I'm launching this project and thinking about what I want to do next, there's always that horror of, oh my God, there's the abyss. Right. And then you remember that, eventually, a topic will find you. You just have to know generally what the broad strokes are that you're looking for. And in the case of Fallout, my broad strokes were that I knew I wanted to do a powerful historical newsroom story that really drove home for readers the deadly importance of an independent press, largely because of the climate in which we find ourselves right now. For the last 4.5, 5 years, our independent press has been attacked by our own government, by our own president, journalists designated enemies of the people. I've been horrified, disgusted, every word in that sort of general range by this turn of events. And so it just felt really important in this moment to remind Americans and a global audience, really, what was at stake with really protecting our fourth estate.
Right.
And so, I was reading, because I have an affinity. I have an academic affinity for World War II. I'm well versed in it, but mostly the European theater. I was just tearing through testimonies, World War II newsroom testimonies, trying to find my story, and everything had been done. Murrow, Gellhorn, Hemingway. I mean, it's all been done to death, and they're relentlessly fascinating, but it needed, and nothing was fitting the bill of, also what's this Watergate level, of piece of reporting that's going to tell the story. My husband, who's also a newsman, and I were at dinner one night, and he just said casually to me, I wonder how Hiroshima and Nagasaki were covered. And for us, it was really a logistical question, because, we're trained as journalists, and everybody knows, in our world, whoever controls the ground controls the story. So it was a logistical question. How on earth, would people have gotten into, nuclear fallout zones, 1945, in a heavily occupied country, and get the story out? And I didn't really know a lot about Hersey, but then, that was like a Hitchcock pull zoom moment for me, where I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And so I researched, and I found that not a lot had been written on it, and nothing. When I came across Hersey's story and how important it had been, nobody had documented how he got the story. Nobody had really documented the significance of how it revealed the true aftermath in Hiroshima. Wow. And the bomb's effects on humans. But it also, that his article turned book really revealed the extent to which the U.S. government had significantly covered up these details from its public and from the world at large. And in my line of business, when you find a story like that hasn't been told, you leap on that story.
Right.
And I mean, it's like, lying on meat. You're like, okay, that's it. So that's how that came about.
Okay, so let's jump into the meat, as it were. So the United States drops the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which may or may not have ended the war. That's a whole nother story, but that's not for us to go into right now. But concerning your book, and I love this part of your book, because it says that basically the 2 atomic bombs were somehow the most powerful explosions in the history of humankind, and yet, supposedly, according to our government, no, there's no lingering effects. Everything is fine. So we're going to go into the kind of the cloak and dagger in just a moment, but if you can give us an idea of what the official line is concerning these 2 bombs from the Truman administration on down, General Leslie Groves, if you can give us an idea of what the American people were being told at the time, because you have to realize the American people are just happy the war is over, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's funny because Hiroshima, the story of the atomic bombs, have this strange distinction of being the most covered story of the war, but also the most covered up. And when Harry Truman announced that an atomic bomb had been used on Hiroshima, first of all, nobody knew what an atomic bomb was. I mean, there were tens of thousands of employees working on the bombs, for the Manhattan Project, who had no idea what they were working on. Even the team of pilots who was going to, do the bombing missions, a lot, if not most of them, had no idea what their mission was going to be. Right. I mean, it was cloaked in such extreme secrecy. So, the announcement comes out, we've just used an atomic bomb on our enemy. What's an atomic bomb? Oh, okay. This is what it is. This is what Truman says. He says it's a mega weapon. It draws its power from the sun. I mean, there's a lot of pseudo biblical language that's used to describe it, just to drive home the enormity of the weapon. But here's the catch. It's immediately sort of described as a conventional mega weapon, even though it's clearly a different beast entirely. It was billed even in a huge headline in the New York Times as being equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. And so people were immediately encouraged to think about about it as again a conventional weapon, just another piece of arsenal, which is how Harry Truman would put it later. I'm sorry, it was another piece of artillery, and so then we're looking at pictures, or audiences and readers are seeing pictures coming out of Japan after Hiroshima and then Nagasaki of the mushroom clouds, and eventually landscape devastation pictures are released. And these seem to tell the story of the destruction, but they don't tell the story of the distinctive destruction, namely that these are the bombs that continue to kill long after detonation. Right. And what you're not seeing in initial press reports or in military releases, approved military material coming out, are pictures of the victims or any description of what is happening to people who survived the blast. I mean, the deaths, the radiation poisoning was absolutely horrific. Right. And it would take, there were some initial press reports, which we can get to or not, later in our conversation, that indicated that there was something sinister and strange happening to blast survivors. There was some terrible affliction. But after those initial reports, it goes quiet, and the government has the upper hand in terms of controlling the story and making Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the true aftermath into restricted topics. And also, President Truman wasn't the only person, obviously, to depict, this bomb in conventional terms. And, Leslie Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project, took an immediate and personal role in downplaying these after effects. Look, there was great concern in the states, within the government and the military, already during the fire bombings of Tokyo, that the U.S. was going to win the war, and it was a bitterly won military victory, but at what cost? And so Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, had worried after Tokyo's firebombing, are we going to get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities? Wow. So at the time, in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima, Lesley Groves immediately dispatches a team to inspect Hiroshima to find out, let's find out, because they didn't really understand the full ramifications and effects of the weapon that they had created and detonated over this, population, largely civilian, of 300,000 people. So on one hand, he sends a team to quietly find out, what in hell is going on? What does this bomb do to humans? In the meantime, there are tens of thousands of Allied troops that are converging on Japan for occupation, including the atomic cities. So they're scrambling to find out what's what. In the meantime, he personally co-hosts a press junket with Oppenheimer at the site of the testing of the first bomb, which had taken place on July 16th of 1945 in New Mexico. And he's for paddling like hell, to make the case that there's actually no such thing as lingering radiation. You could live in Hiroshima forever. Just look at how safe it was in New Mexico where they were standing. Meanwhile, as he and the junket of reporters are standing there in, protective booties, and, the irony being that was actually a far more, radioactively polluted site than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Wow. Later that fall, he's hauled in front of Congress to talk about the weapons. And, by then he has started conceding, that there is such a thing as radiation poisoning, especially, for people who have taken in a lot of radiation at the moment of the blast. But he's still downplaying it. And he even says, just somewhat unimaginably during this hearing, that actually, even if there is such thing as radiation poisoning, it's actually, quote, a very pleasant way to die, end quote. So you can see the efforts that were being made to downplay, spin, and cover up the true nature of the bombs that they had created and just detonated.
And you can clearly see Groves' motivation, because his name will forever be attached to the bomb. So if it goes down in history as a bad thing, obviously he will too. So, I mean, that's completely selfish of him, but that's his job at the same time. So I get that. So you have the official American line from Washington. And if you just think of it as a really big conventional bomb, and you see pictures of bombed out buildings, they kind of go together. You're right. The details are not being released to the people. And now you've got General MacArthur, who is literally the American Caesar in Japan. He controls everything. His SCAP controls everything, which brings us to someone like John Hersey, who has an idea of what he wants to do. He needs to get there and get some details to tell a story, but he's got to get through MacArthur and all the people that work for him. So if you could tell us a little bit about John, introduce him to us and how he gets to Japan, I think that might be a good way to get to the next part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So John Hersey in 1945, when the bombs were detonated, he's young. He's in his early 30s, but he's already quite renowned. And he was a war correspondent for Time magazine and Life since 1939. He'd been in practically every theater around the world. And he was also a Pulitzer Prize winning war novelist for his 1944 novel, Bell for Adano. He was on top of all of that. He was a commended war hero. He had helped evacuate wounded Marines in a battle between the Japanese and the Americans in the Solomon Islands. Okay, to make things even worse, he's movie star handsome. He's married to, a Southern heiress. They have a beautiful family. They live in Manhattan's Park Avenue. I mean, he has the most charmed life on the planet. Not that he doesn't work hard for it, but he's also, he's quite well known and famous too. I mean, he's in Winchell's column, and he gets invited to the White House. I mean, it's quite a hard life because he's obviously in combat zones and war zones, but when he's not, he's living quite a glamorous literary war journalist life.
Sure.
So Hersey. He had left Time Inc. when the bomb went off over Hiroshima, and he first heard about it over, over the radio, Truman's radio address, and he was in New York, and something really disturbed. I mean, he was rattled as hell by the announcement because, on the one hand, he had been in the Pacific Theater, he had he had covered the battles between the Japanese and the Americans, and he witnessed firsthand what he called the tenacity of the Japanese military. And he, like many other Americans, believed that they were facing a situation in which the Japanese really would fight, as they put it, savagely to the last man to defend their homeland from invasion, which was, military plans were drawn up for that. It was slated to take place in the fall of 1945 if the bombs hadn't been ready for military use by then. Right. So, Hersey, on the one hand, he thinks, look, this is horrific. And, one bomb destroying an entire city, this portends terrible things for the future of humanity. But at the same time, he also admits later that he was relieved because he did feel that it would speed the end of the war. So he took solace in that. Right. 3 days later, he hears, along with the rest of the world, that Nagasaki has been bombed by, a plutonium bomb. And he's horrified. I mean, he thinks, it's akin to a war crime. We had given them a warning with Hiroshima, just give the Japanese time to, process what had happened to them and surrender. He just felt like it was completely egregious. This is, his point of view, not mine. I'm just, just to clarify that this is entirely his outlook in that moment. So he knows at that point, that he's going to write about the bombs in some capacity. He just doesn't know at that point. And as you pointed out earlier, look, the American public, including Hersey, they were exhausted. The world population was exhausted. I mean, they were being encouraged to look forward instead of backwards right away. The bandwidth for people to really comprehend one more outsized atrocity story. I mean, it was a pretty thin bandwidth. People couldn't take any more. So, at first, even Hersey isn't figuring out how he can get in right away. But then he and his editor at the New Yorker, because he eventually started writing for them, his editor William Shawn are having lunch one day, and Hersey's planning to go back into the Asian theater. He's going to go and do some reporting from China, and they review the coverage of Hiroshima up to that point, and they realize that it's been, again, as we said earlier, the most covered story, but the most covered up also. They realized that there's been no reporting on the human toll on the ground. There's no human story there at all. It was all about what had happened to buildings, as Hersey later put it. He wanted to find out what happened to humans. And, he's from a big war correspondent community at that point. And he and William Shawn, William Shawn had also dispatched reporters for the New Yorker all around the world throughout the war. They would have known how completely under control the Japanese and the Allied press were by that point. Again, this is winter of 1945, 1946. And so they began to try to figure out how Hersey would get in. And, the restrictions on reporters were completely stringent. And, Hersey is able to do it.
So there's some stuff I'm going to leave out because I truly want the readers to, and this is going to sound strange, I truly want the readers to be hit with the words in the story the way I was. So I'm going to skip over some things, but if you could give us a sense of, so Hersey, I know he goes to China, then he finally does make it into Japan to Tokyo. He's there for a limited time, but if you could give us an idea of what he finds in Hiroshima, some of the people that he talks to, and some of the stories that he is going to bring back, because like you were saying, I've had enough of the destroyed buildings and all that kind of stuff. How did it affect the people there on that morning that the bomb goes off? That's the story that he eventually decides that he wants to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's no small feat that he was able to get into the country and get to Hiroshima to report that story at all, because, yes. They were really restricted topics. Several reporters had gotten into Hiroshima in the earliest part of the war, in the earliest days of the occupation, and had printed embarrassing stories to the U.S. military about, again, the sinister, what they called disease X that was ravaging blast survivors. And after that point, reporters were immediately restricted. And it was amazing. It was chaotic in the early days of the occupation, as you can imagine. But the MacArthur team, they got it together fast. Right. And, they really quickly enacted a Japanese press code. The Japanese press couldn't even mention Hiroshima in a poem, much less a press report. Allied reporters. There were so many ways in which they were kept corralled, and they, had to apply for permission to travel around the country. The only way you could get around the country it was, through jeeps or through other, vehicles that had to be issued by the military, and who controlled the gasoline. Guess who? The Army. And the Army's press relations officers were not at all shy about reminding Allied journalists, right. Guess what? We control the food too. If you want to eat, you have to play ball. Wow. So if you reported on a restricted topic like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, you could have your credentials revoked. You could be kicked out of the country. Your editors at home were called by the PROs or press relations officers and told to send replacements. They were just under thumb. Wow. Hersey, on the other hand, he sneaks into the country almost as a Trojan horse. And I say that because, he, unlike some of the other reporters who had gotten in earlier to Hiroshima, a lot of them had butted heads with MacArthur's forces for a long time. They hated censorship. They hated the press relations officers. Hersey had been a good team player to the U.S. military throughout the war, and including having written a rather glowing biography about General MacArthur. And Hersey later wished that he could take it out of print because it was way too sucky-uppy to MacArthur. Right. But, if you're vying to get into occupied Japan, having written, a suck-up book about MacArthur's, it's going to help your case, right? Yes. So in he comes. And, they even give him, when I say they, I mean MacArthur's forces, they give Hersey permission to travel to the Hiroshima prefecture for 2 weeks, probably largely in the belief that by the time Hersey's there, and by now we're in May of 1946, that first of all, Hiroshima is an old story. Second of all, and that the public doesn't care as much. And second of all, they've established such control and censorship over stories about the city that they probably feel pretty confident that even if he were going to write something, that they would be able to censor it. So he gets permission to go down there. He does, with the help of an English-speaking German priest and an English-speaking Japanese pastor who knew each other. He's able to make inroads very quickly because he only has 14 days.
Right.
He's able to make inroads very quickly with the blast survivors who have started to return to the city, and he interviews dozens of them. Each of them having harrowingly unique but equally ghastly stories about their experiences on the day of August 6th, 1945. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind also that these interviews are taking place in a desolate, rubble-filled landscape. I mean, it's like Hershey had gotten to the city, and we have to remember he's a war correspondent who has seen everything from combat to concentration camps, but nothing had prepared him for Hiroshima's devastation because it was all one bomb. I mean, to get this level of destruction before the bomb, it would have to be a fleet of bombers that would have come over and raised the hell out of the city.
Right.
So here he is interviewing the blast survivors in what's still essentially a mass graveyard, and remains today, by the way, a graveyard. Mm-hmm. Hearing all of these terrible testimonies about what it had been like to be on the receiving end of nuclear attack by the U.S. government and U.S. military, and what it had been like to be, a young mother or, a young doctor or a widow with 3 little children, going about your daily business at 8:15 in the morning when all of a sudden, catastrophe strikes.
Because I'm glad you brought that up, because if you told me I was about to go to a city that night after night after night, 300 bombers flew over and dropped incendiary bombs or general explosives, whatever, I would have a decent idea of what to expect. But if I go to a city and it's completely devastated, it's a year later, it still hasn't recovered because there's not enough material to even begin to rebuild, and then you tell me all this was done by one bomb, how could you not feel that Pandora's box has just been cracked open just a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and Hersey recognized a mere year later that bomb that had devastated the city and caused all of this, biblical grade damage was a primitive bomb. I mean, it was literally the first bomb that had ever been used, atomic bomb that had ever been used in the history of human warfare. Right. And I mean, it just felt like it portended the end of days. And he felt very strongly and very quickly that the only chance that civilization was going to have at surviving, having witnessed what he saw in Hiroshima, was if humans started to see the humanity in each other again. I mean, he had seen the worst of human nature in World War II. He had seen, what the Japanese had done to the Chinese. Right. He had seen what the Germans had done to everybody. Yes. And now he, saw what the Americans did to the Japanese. And he just thought, this has to stop across the board. We have to be able to see what he said it was the humanity and even our most misled enemies, because otherwise we just don't have a chance at survival in the atomic age.
Right. I mean, everybody gets to make their own judgment call about something like World War II, but you can go from, look, they attacked us, so we're defending ourselves. That's understandable to everybody, but you don't want to get to the point where you're just as bad as the bad guys, because no one wants to think of themselves equivalent to the Japanese Empire or to the Nazis. And here he is looking at this devastation going, if we keep doing this, because we didn't just do it once, we dropped it on 2 cities. If we keep doing this, if this is how we solve our problems in the future, are we any better than those that we just defeated? Yeah,
absolutely. And it qualifies the moral victory. And, the Allies had, just had a tremendous military victory over Hitler, for Christ's sake. And right. Japan and Italy. I mean, this was a moment where they could have truly reveled, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki were complicating factors. Yes. Hiroshima might seem on its face like it was less of a complicated decision because, it was widely billed as having, again, facilitated the end of sped the end of the war, saving, many Japanese and American lives alike. But at the same time, scratch the surface and you find out, well, actually, Hiroshima had some military value, but, you just nuked a city of 300,000. It was 90% civilians who died in it. So that complicates that moral victory right there. Nagasaki, is a totally different thing because, as Hersey felt, did you really need to drop the second bomb so quickly? Mm-hmm. And, did we give Japan sufficient time to surrender before, ending instantly tens of thousands of additional lives? Right. And so again, these are very complicating factors when it comes to the U.S. being able to claim an unqualified moral victory at that moment. And Hersey's aware of that when he's doing this reporting. I can't overemphasize how controversial it was going to be for readers to be confronted with a humanized portrait of Japanese victims. So, I mean, his cojones in rolling out this reporting, I'm still almost speechless that he and the New Yorker were brave enough to do it.
Yeah, go in, and I'm just going to mention this real quick. We don't have to go to this yet, but one, you're absolutely right. Getting the story, publishing the story, and kind of, if I can use this phrase, getting away with it was absolutely amazing to me, because I was expecting, I didn't know this full detail, so I was expecting you to write something like, they get the story, they've got it written up, the government slams the brakes, and it never comes out, and it's only come out, like years later. I was truly surprised that they were able to get past all the censors, and we can get into some of that, but if you could, because I don't want to give too much away for the readers, if you could maybe just select one of those 6 people that Hersey is going to write about and give us an idea of what their day was like that morning. Obviously, they have no idea what's about to happen. And if you could just maybe share one of the experiences of one of those people.
I will share the broad strokes of the experience of one of Hersey's main protagonist, Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who was a young Japanese pastor, but with the caveat that, some of it's quite graphic.
Sure.
So just so, your listeners are prepared for that. And I'll try to be somewhat restrained, but Hersey was not. So if you do read his account, you'll get the full details. But Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto was a young Protestant minister based in Hiroshima. He lived there with his young wife, Chisa, and their then 8-month-old daughter, Coco. Mm-hmm. And he had studied English at Emory the year before finishing the year before Pearl Harbor. And that's how Hersey was able to communicate with him. And he also acted as a translator for Hersey. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, Reverend Tanimoto, he hadn't eaten anything. The city was already starving, but he got up. He went out of the house. He was helping a neighbor move furniture to the outskirts of the city because the city hadn't been bombed yet, unlike dozens of other Japanese cities which had been bombed or razed. But the residents of Hiroshima had heard that there might be something special coming their way, that the U.S. military had been saving them as a target for something rather more grand. And the nervousness was extremely high. Everybody was in overdrive. They were raising houses to create fire lanes to try to contain fire from potential firebombing. So that's where their mind was at. There was no way that they could have known what indeed was being planned for them. So when the bomb goes off, Reverend Tanimoto is on a hill a couple of miles outside of the city, and nobody ever reported to Hersey that they remembered hearing a boom. They just remember seeing a blinding flash, and then the thing that's followed afterwards is like an apocalypse of fire and houses collapsing and projectile objects flying through the air. So he falls to the ground, and when he rises, he looks down the hill and he sees his entire city is in flames, and he's completely confused because where was the fleet of bombs? They hadn't heard anything. There were no air raid sirens. There was no warning. There was no fleet that had come to, for instance, like the one that had eviscerated Tokyo. Mm-hmm. So then he starts running down towards the city, and people are starting to stream out of it. And what he sees is just horrific. I mean, people are, they've had their clothes blown off or burned off their bodies. Their skin is hanging in sheets. I mean, it's like he said it was like seeing a procession of mutilated ghosts. He is trying to get into his neighborhood. And you have to remember, like, the idea that you could even detect a neighborhood in the ruins at this point. Mm-hmm. Is folly. Everything is, the closer you get to the city center, which was the point of detonation, things are just flattened, and there are walls of fire consuming the area. But he's manically trying to get to his house and to his parish. And, at one point he finds, cushions, and he douses them in this water nearby, and he covers himself in cushions and charges into the fire to try to find his family. Miraculously, he finds his wife and his young daughter. They were in their house when the bomb went off. It collapsed on top of them. Miraculously, his wife had been able to chisel through the ruins and get the baby out. Both of them had survived. And they, I don't even want to describe the scene in the city as they're running through it. And there's one park on the edge of the city where people are flocking to take refuge there. And he and his, and this is, by the way, this is just the beginning of his ordeal. He deposits his family there, and then he commits himself to trying to help survivors get to the park. And that's when things get, I would argue that the detonation point was, the detonation moment was probably, it was horrific, but the minutes and hours and the first 24 hours after the fact were just the stuff of apocalyptic nightmares. And Hersey recounted his ordeal in excruciating detail, and what he saw, for the rest of the 24 hours as he tried to rescue people and bring them over into the park. What happened to the people in the park? I mean, they just would die within minutes of arriving. I mean, the place was just littered with corpses. I said I wouldn't get too graphic, and here I have gotten graphic. But Reverend Tanimoto, he does later. He survives. Obviously, his family does survive. I actually toured Hiroshima with Koko Tanimoto, his infant daughter. Then she was 74 when I walked through the city with her, and we revisited the park where all of these people had tried to take refuge, and it's just literally one of the most haunted places you've ever seen.
I just have to say real quick, some of the images that really stuck with me is, you're right, a lot of people were going to the park and it becomes this makeshift place for people to get triaged. But again, as soon as they sit down, it doesn't take very long before a lot of them are dying. The vast majority of doctors in the city were dead. The vast majority of nurses in the city were dead. And the hospitals themselves, because I think they were more closer to the center of the city, they've been devastated. And so you have this nightmare people. But even the people who are trying to help each other, they don't know what they're dealing with. They just think it's a really big bomb that's gone off. And nothing that's happening to the people is making sense to those who are trying to take care of them. Just the eeriness of that stayed with me.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only person in the city at that moment who might have had some idea about what was happening was one surviving doctor who ran downstairs to get some X-ray plates, and they were already exposed. And so that was the first indication that this was an experimental mega weapon. But I mean, otherwise, the doctor, the few doctors who survived, or medics who survived, and then others eventually arrived, in small groups from other cities to try to help. They had no idea what, as you said, what they were dealing with. They're giving vitamin shots. They're looking at, people are coming in with horrific radiation poisoning, and so they're throwing up. They're losing hair. They thought it was gas because they're still in the mentality of World War I. World War I, they say, was the chemists' war. Right, where it's all about gas. World War II was the physicists' war in the way that it ended, but the Japanese didn't realize that yet. They had no idea, and so they have no idea how to treat the victims who come in. The hospital scenes. Look, doing the research on what the hospitals were like was the most harrowing part of all of this research for me. Two of Hersey's protagonists in his story, Hiroshima, are doctors, one of whom, stays in the city, treats people for 72 hours straight. By the third day, most of his patients who he's treated on the first day are dead. The second doctor, who's pretty gravely injured but probably still could have worked, is a far more cowardly fellow and flees the city at first opportunity without staying on hand to treat survivors.
I have to say this real quick, and I don't know if you thought about this when you were writing, but it's easy now for me in 2020 to sit and judge this guy and to get angry at him. Oh, you coward, you should have ran in there and you should have helped people. You've got this knowledge. Why don't you help people? But I mean, that's a very human reaction. There's complete devastation. Obviously, this isn't the normal thing that's going on. And so at first I got angry at him, and then I'm like, I'm sure a decent percentage of people would have run away as well, because I mean, it's just so overwhelming. What difference are you going to make? I don't even know if that's fair, but I think I understood his, for lack of a better word, either self-preservation or cowardice.
I think that's fair, and I think it's really humane of you to take that point of view. I mean, I was, in many ways, I feel like I took my cues from Hersey's tone towards him in terms of how I felt, which was, and also which was less than impressed on my part. But I think a lot of that also has to do with, when he was really measured up as a character against, Reverend Tanimoto,
Yes.
who, was literally ferrying, people, across, a burning river, for hours and hours. I mean, the heroics were so extreme, from the people who did exhibit heroism, but you're absolutely right. Also, I mean, I don't think, look, just the trauma of reading Hersey's book is so intense. I can't even imagine what the traumatic shock must have been like to be a human being under those circumstances. So, I concede that you're right, and who are we to judge? This guy, this other doctor who took the opportunity to leave hell.
Let's just go ahead and jump into this. But again, I'll let you decide how far we go, because I want to leave so much for the people. When Hersey's writing this, he's not giving facts, figures, this is many buildings blown up, it had a devastation, or it had explosion of this strong, whatever. That's been done before. In fact, like you said, that's been done ad nauseum. He is literally writing this with a little bit of narrative because he wants to hook the people, and he wants them to, like you said earlier, this could be Houston, this could be Akron, Ohio. He is putting them in this situation, if they can actually get through reading this article that he writes. It's like 30,000 words or whatever. And so he is not tricking the reader, but he's doing everything he can to say, yes, this is horrible, but it's very important for you to read and understand what I'm putting in front of you and what I have seen with my own eyes. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and isn't it a miracle that he did get people to read it? Because think about how much incentive Americans had to not read that story.
Absolutely.
And we can get more to how it was rolled out and received later. But I will say that, look, Americans hated the Japanese. They were still furious about Pearl Harbor. They were furious about Japanese atrocities in the Philippines and throughout the Pacific and China. And, POW stories by the time, Hersey was writing this, the POWs had returned to the States, and, how they were treated was horrific also. And so, I mean, the Americans had, from a certain point of view, probably had very little incentive, again, to read this narrative that humanizes, the Japanese, their former Japanese enemies, who, by the way, are being now groomed to be allies in the Cold War, but that's another story.
Right.
And so how Hersey does do it is he realizes that he has to make this story read like a novel. And what's more, it has to be a novel you cannot put down. It has to be a propulsive narrative. So when he interviewed all the blast survivors on the ground, he picked 6 people, including Reverend Tanimoto and the doctor who we just discussed, whose stories were just really unforgettable. And they all of their paths had sort of overlapped in, before the bombing, during the bombing, and then after the bombing. And so he was able to create this story that you really, to this day, when you pick it up, you don't put it down until you're done. Right. And then you feel like you've been through hell after you've read it, but you can't not read it. And that was the experience when it was released for millions of Americans and people around the world. And so, again, it was just a staggering achievement that, even people who hadn't read it were talking about it and knew about Hersey's story, because it was that, again, unputdownable.
Right. Yeah, and like we said, the New Yorker and Hersey gets away with this, if you will. But again, I'm going to leave that for the readers, for people to pick up a copy of your book. So he's interviewed his people. He's got his notes. I believe he wrote in shorthand, and I imagine he's got a lot of notes and a lot of things burned in his memory. But he gets back to New York, and he starts writing this up, but he can't just take his time because the anniversary is coming up, and I imagine the editors want to be able to put this out in a timely way. So it's crunch time. Even though he's been through hell and back viewing this, it's crunch time for Hersey because he's got to get this written down on paper.
Oh yeah, and as you say, he's writing it in New York, and that was extremely clever of him, right? Because if he had written everything on the ground in Japan, that augments his chances of being censored by MacArthur. Another reporter who had gone into Nagasaki and tried to make a similar report. His report had been confiscated and quote unquote lost. Yet another reporter had a film that he had taken in Hiroshima go mysteriously missing. So to that end, William Shawn, who was Hersey's editor at the New Yorker, reminded him via a telegram from New York to Japan while Hersey was still over there. We think it best that you write it back in the States. So Hersey he comes back and he's writing like hell, and he's not just recounting. He's not just recounting the testimonies of these 6 people. He's also really laying down medical facts about what happened to them. He's laying down, the broad strokes of what these bombs do to the human body. The symptoms, the ghastly symptoms of radiation poisoning, and he's doing it in a way that exposes again. He's doing it in a way that exposes how much has been concealed from the American public about these weapons that had been created in secret and detonated in their name. And after Hersey's report comes out, because it's so steeped in this previously suppressed information, the government and the military are never ever going to really be able to portray atomic weapons as conventional mega weapons.
Absolutely. And that's the whole point of this. The genie is out of the bottle, so to speak, and you can't just say this is a really big conventional bomb because now we know better which one hopefully won't be used again because we're all scared out of our pants. And 2, you've only got to please pray to God that it's never used in America because it's not just the blast. It's what happens after the blast that people now are aware of.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And the fact is what's on everybody's mind by 1946 is the U.S. has the nuclear monopoly. Yes. And has had since 1945, but they don't know how much longer they are going to have it. And General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, predicted, around that time or in the previous year that it would take the Soviets 5 to 20 years. Well, guess what? It's 1949 when they get there, so it's only 4 years. Right. So, for Americans to be equipped with the facts, and for a global audience to be equipped with the facts of, this is what nuclear warfare does. This is what's at stake if we launch another nuclear attack. This is what's at stake if somebody else attaches us. We had better get a grip on our nukes, on our nuclear policy, on our nuclear diplomacy, and start dealing with this fast.
Absolutely. And we also need to work on diplomacy in general because when diplomacy breaks down, that's when wars come. And now we have the ability to wipe out, entire continents. So you touched on it a couple of minutes ago, but if you could give us another, and what I want to do for the reader is I want to save the point where he is writing this and the publishers get it and all the things they have to go through to make sure this actually comes out, because that's an incredible story in itself for the New Yorker, for the publisher, for the editor. And I really did enjoy that. But this is, and this is a really bad analogy, but this article in itself is a bomb that is dropped on the world. Now, like you said, the American government can no longer deny what the bomb is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I won't ruin it for your readers either, but there is a moment, as you know, from having read the book, in which, Hersey and his editors, they prepared this thing where the article is endangered because of potential. The government is put in the position where they are able to shut this down, and miraculously, Hersey and his team still get the report through. Wow. I won't go into the details of that, but the fact is that the people who did greenlight it within the government and the War Department ultimately, I don't think that they really realized the import Hersey's reporting and the impact of it, namely, again, that from their point of view, to a certain extent, again, Hiroshima had happened a year before. So many stories had taken place since then. The world had moved on. I don't think, that the idea that a story could capture the attention of millions of people, including leaders around the world. They didn't anticipate that. Well, guess what? That's what happened. So when the story comes out, it's a blockbuster success, mega success. I mean, the magazine sells out right away. You have to get black market copies of it. Luckily it goes into book form right away also. And, that was already in play before the article came out. Millions of copies are being produced around the world. And so Hersey has achieved his goal of making it unput downable. And it is embarrassing for the U.S. government because, of what it reveals about the bombs. And what one reader wrote into the New Yorker, that it took the quote unquote 4th of July attitude out of the Americans' feelings about Hiroshima. Not necessarily because all of them were feeling bad about, the Japanese survivors, but because they had a new solemnity about what Hiroshima portended for them and what it portended for human civilization. So many of them at that moment began living in the atomic age. They'd been living in it already in reality for a year, but emotionally and intellectually, they began to live in the atomic age when Hersey's article came out.
Right. Now no one can say they didn't know. So obviously we need to do better when it comes to dealing with other nations with diplomacy and treating other nations with respect, or because it's only a matter of time before other countries, like you said, are going to get the ability to wipe us out. And when I read your epilogue, I completely agree with what you just said a second ago. It was timing. It was the way he wrote it. It was the way the New Yorker brilliantly put it out. And so a lot of different factors came together. And the Americans needed this wake-up call because if they don't know it, all the details of this bomb, they're probably going to be okay with the government and use it in the future. But now the government knows that the people know, and that's because of Hersey. So, Lesley, I just want to thank you for this book. This was an eye-opener for me. After I got over my nightmares, it was an eye-opener for me, and I just enjoyed the experience sitting on my porch, going through this for the good and the bad. And like you said, we saw heroes, we saw cowards, but at the end of the day, it was a story that had to get out.
Well, thank you so much for reading it, and I'm so glad that it made such an impression on you. And I really hope that your readers like it too. It's the great professional love of my life. I'm already afraid that I'm never going to have another project that I am as passionate about as I was about this one.
No, I understand. It's best to have one at all as opposed to not. So no, you should be very proud because again, absolutely amazing. So the book is Fallout: The Hiroshima Cover Up and the Reporter Who Revealed It to the World. Lesley MM Blume, thank you very much for your time. And again, thank you very much for this book.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Ray.
When you hire your local CertaPro painters, you get the power of doing it right. Detailed project proposals, excellent customer service, and trusted professionals who get the job done on time and on budget. The power of experience. We're kings of the scaffolding and pros with the stucco. We've been there, done that. Get your project started at CertaPro.com and get the power of pro.
Each CertaPro painter's business is independently owned and operated.